This is Damian Macy from Friends of the Marshall Public Library on the Oral History Project. And this evening, I'm at the home of Dr. Steve Macke, 808 North 8th Street, and sitting here with he and his wife in their lovely home. And I'm going to turn that over to him and let him talk.
Okay. Well, I guess what I'd have, the best thing I can say is I've been blessed by God to have been brought up where I was, when I was, and been able to live here since we moved back here after I finished residency. I sometimes think when somebody calls me Dr. Macke, I thought, who are they talking about? And it's some days it doesn't always sink in, but I grew up near the Wabash River, east of West Union, with 6 brothers and sisters, in a house with 3 bedrooms, which would be unheard of nowadays.
Cozy.
Yes, it was cozy, but it never bugged me too much. I mean, everybody sometimes would like a little more elbow room, but I guess it was that way from the beginning, and that's just how it was. We had great parents. Anybody that would put up with 7 children without doing one of them in for one reason or another is kind of exceptional nowadays. But I think it was nothing short of a miracle that we all survived to adulthood. Growing up on a farm and with mechanized farming, and not to mention the other shenanigans kids pull off when their parents aren't looking. In fact, we had a cousin who wasn't goofing off that was killed in a farm accident, probably not 4 miles from our home. He was helping his dad plow off an end row. It was David Rhodes, and flipped the tractor over on him. So things like that happen, and it's still a miracle to me that we all made it. And we always had a lot of fun together for the most part. We'd have our scraps, but you have to expect that of kids. But
And Steve, what was your parents' name?
Dad was Arnold C. Macke, and Mom was Mary Spittler Macke. She grew up around Allright. She was 3 years older than him, but I think they met, they got set up on almost a blind date by Annabelle and Olin Wells, I think. I could be wrong about that. But they dated with him. When they got married, they decided waiting 3 days for the license to go through, and Illinois wasn't anything worthwhile, so they went with, I think, that same couple, and went down to Henderson, Kentucky, and crossed over there, got married, I don't know, stayed a night and came back. And they lived in the same house I grew up in for all their married lives, which was, gosh, how long was it? They got married in 40, wasn't 40, and Dad passed away in 99, so 59 years. Mm-hmm. And Mom went ahead and lived there for a couple more years, and then passed away out of Burnsides after a stroke. But I guess I decided to go into something other than farming. I didn't know if I could work for my dad. He was pretty demanding, and I'd always been fascinated with science, and I decided I'd go a different way. I think they'd already run out of farm ground. I thought they weren't making any more. That's what Will Rogers said. And So
Did you come into Martin's or Marshall for school?
Yes, I graduated from Marshall High School, went to grade school here. The year I started, about the year, I think it was about 55, 56, was when they shut down most of the
Yeah.
country schools and brought them in town and on buses. And that was about the year I started school. So I rode the bus with my brothers and sister, and then later my younger sister Alice rode to town. She was the last of the bunch, but I guess there was a Macke in Marshall School for how many years do we figure it was? At least 14 straight years once they started coming to town. And they did their first school at a country, my older brothers and sister did their first schooling at Brick School, which is right across from Brick Church. But the school has been gone for a number of years. But it was a true one-room schoolhouse. But everybody else, all the rest of us graduated from here in Marshall.
Was the West Union School still in operation at that time?
I think it was, but see, it was in the Hudsonville School
Yeah.
District, so it didn't directly affect us. It stayed open for a while in the grade school. I think they pretty soon closed that down and took everybody to Hudsonville. I don't remember what year that was, but
And what year did you graduate from Marshall?
graduated in 1968, and then I graduated from Eastern Illinois University with a zoology degree in 72, and then went on to medical school at University of Illinois. But they started having satellite campuses just a year or so before that, so I didn't have to do any of my education in Chicago. Sometimes I regret that now, but because it would have been nice to have gotten more familiar with Chicago, but the big city just kind of intimidated me. I just was too much off the farm. It was too far away from home. And I managed to go the first year at Champaign-Urbana, which was only the second year they'd had that branch of the medical school, and then I did the last 3 years in Peoria, and that's where I met Beth on a blind date. A good friend of mine and his wife figured I would have been single and happy long enough, or at least single. And got us on a blind date. And
Was Beth in nursing or training or something?
she was a school teacher.
I was teaching.
Oh,
But she was teaching in Streeter at the time.
okay.
But she came down because her friend from her hometown, close by, told her she wanted to set her up on a date.
And also to interview.
Yeah, she wanted to. She wanted to move to that area anyway because Streeter wasn't a very happening town, I guess.
But they were doing riffing too.
Yeah, they were playing around with the budget and the employees, so she decided it was time to get out of there. So that worked out for me. So
Were you married in Peoria then?
no, we got married at her church in Stewartson,
Oh, Stuart.
and we got married just after I graduated, 76, and then we lived the next 3 years in Rockford, Illinois, where I did my internship and residency. And sometimes I think that was a mistake, but it worked out, because that was the coldest cotton picking place. It was terribly cold. That I had a sister that lived up in the north end of the state, and we visited with her quite a bit, so I didn't get too homesick, despite everything. And then we had our first 2 kids up there. Chris was born in 78, and Meg was born in 81?
79.
79, excuse me. See, that's why I told her to come in. I knew that, and I just wasn't figuring it fast enough in my head. Math was never my strong suit. But And then we moved down here, and on the way down, Beth had to pull the car over because the baby needed nursing, and I didn't see her pull off, and I went on by in the U-Haul van and wound up getting about running out of gas in Kansas, Illinois. And this is for cell phones, so we couldn't keep in touch. I think I called home and somebody brought up some money and I was able to put gas in the truck and come on home.
So where was she then? Did she go
Well,
on by, or where did he go?
She eventually got back in, didn't you? And you came on home then, because you didn't know where I went, and I didn't know where you were.
And I had almost a 2-year-old, well, not quite 2, and then the baby, because Megan was about 6 months.
Yeah, so you had your hands full.
So what year was it then you actually moved back to Marshall?
1979.
Nine?
And I practiced for many years. 30?
Maria was born
Yeah.
in 81.
Yeah,
once we were
shouldn't.
here.
I don't know why I was thinking that order, but yeah, Maria was born after we'd been here 2 years, and anyway, then I think it was 2003. Well, it wasn't. I practiced here 30 years before I.
Till 09.
Yeah, 09. And things changed a lot in the meantime. And they started HMOs and PPOs and all this stuff. And I thought where I was going to escape all that and maybe slide on into retirement without having to go through that business. But at Union Hospital, talked to me and Dr. Turner about buying out our practices so we'd kind of be their employees for their HMO program. And I thought of being on the outside of that, kind of looking in, didn't sound like a good prospect, so I went with them. But sometimes they make decisions you don't always like, and you either have to put up or shut up. And I guess I maybe unwisely decided to part ways with them after about 15 years. They started changing things and that I didn't agree with, and it wasn't necessarily, well.
Tell them about, practicing with Dr. George.
Probably I'll say more about that, yeah. Everybody that knew George, at some time or another, a lot of them would ask me, how did you stand to work with him? Because they knew he had a very quick temper.
Short fuse.
Yeah, short fuse, and he never once used that on me that I can think of. He never said a cross word to me. He was always helpful. I said he was almost like a Dutch uncle. I think if I'd asked him for money, he probably would have loaned it to me. Or at least he would have referred me down to the bank. But it was a privilege to get a practice with him. It was quite an experience.
Did he have that
shared
cigar
a lot.
lit in the office, or did he just chew it?
A lot of time he did, but he after Union took over, he had to give up the cigars.
Okay.
And he still smoked them at home and in the car anywhere he went, because I traveled with him some.
It was kind of his trademark.
Yes, it was. In fact, he even convinced me to. He didn't really convince me. I started taking up cigars and took up cigars for a while. In fact, smoked at the same time when Paul Martin still owned the grocery, the drugstore. He ordered them for George, and he probably gave it to him at cost. But I kind of developed a taste for those, but I got over that. But,
I know in the Burnside, if you're going down the hallway,
you could tell
you
if
could
he'd been
tell
there.
if he had just soon, or within probably the last half hour, gone
Yeah.
down that same corridor.
Yeah, his had a tendency to linger. I grew up. My dad smoked for the first several years after I was born, but he gave it up. But so I was around that, and it didn't bother me. I liked it, but it's not a good habit. But he was great to practice with. I still remember a lot, basically because Christopher, our son, he told me the story. Chris had been practicing baseball while he was in high school. I think he's junior year, sophomore, and they were practicing catching pop flies, and they took the batting machine and just rotated it so it shot way up in the air, and they go up quite a way. And he tried to catch one, and I don't know, it was off. But he hit it right on the end of one. The ball hit right on the end of one of his finger and popped the skin open and dislocated the
Ouch.
end joint. And he described in great detail about his coach coming over and said, "Quit goofing off, Macke." And, "Oh my gosh!" Get him to the doctor. And he came out, and I looked at it, and it about made me half sick. And I
Surely not.
tried to pull on it a little bit. I said, "I can't do this. I was afraid I was going to faint." I mean, I've done it on. I haven't done that many on other people, but doing it on your own kid is a different thing altogether. So I went and got George, and he came in with a cigar between his teeth, and he had a white shirt on, and he tucked his tie in so it didn't flop around. And let's look at this. He grabbed it and wiggled a little bit, and he just popped it like that. And of course, Chris kind of gave a jump, and at the second that happened, it squirted blood out on George's white shirt. And Chris had the presence of mind to say, "Dr. Mitchell, I'm sorry, I got blood on your shirt." He says, "It's all right." And he just walked out.
Happened before.
Yeah, it did happen before. He didn't let that worry him, and that.
Was he one you could easily consult with if you had some question or something that didn't seem
I
quite
did
right?
quite often. He
understood he
had
had-
a world of experience.
Wow.
He'd seen everything, or practically so, as far as I ever ran into. And I would every so often, probably every week. I don't know how often. I would ask him about something, and what do you think about that? What do you think I ought to do? And he would usually give me pretty decent. I mean, he always gave me good advice. I don't think there was ever one I turned around and said, "Oh, there's no way I'm going to do that." He was usually spot on. And
Well, Steve, am I right? As he got older too, even though he was aging, he still kept up to date and was, I guess, forward in modern thinking, wasn't he?
he tried to be. He kept up on continuing medical education. In fact, for several years, we would drive up on Thursday. I don't remember what day it was. Thursday afternoons. I think it was Thursday afternoons. Of course, George was off on that day, and that worked great for him. I had to change my schedule around a bit, but that was okay. They had continuing medical education up at Sarah Bush Hospital, sponsored by American Academy of Family Practice, the Illinois Academy of Family Practice. And they were always well prepared and helpful, and kind of kept you abreast of what the latest was, and George liked that. George really enjoyed helping with surgery, though. That was one thing I remember about him. If he had a patient that he sent to the hospital that required surgery, I don't know if it wasn't many he missed, unless it was just something like when they started doing open heart. He wouldn't have tried to help with that. But I'm not sure they were doing that when he.
Was he actually the surgeon, or just
No, he just
assisting,
assisted.
or be there?
Yeah, he just assisted. He'd go over there early enough and hang around, talk to other doctors, go in and say hi to the patient, and before they put him to sleep, and then often assisted with the procedure, and it didn't make him rich. They would pay. You would send an assistance fee. The doctors often did. I don't remember ever getting an assistance fee, because I didn't do that many of them. But he enjoyed that. But I think it was kind of like a connection with these patients too. He wanted to know what happened,
Right.
and he had the good fortune to have some excellent surgeons to always refer to, so they would have taken good care whether he'd been there or not. But I think he felt that was kind of his obligation. So I was never that good a surgeon, so I said, I'll take good care of you.
So I was probably getting ready to ask, did you participate in surgeries?
A few. I remember a classmate of mine's father was quite a bit older, and he had somehow or other I found out that he had may have backed into it. I mean, find out by accident he had a very large abdominal aneurysm. So we scheduled him for surgery, and I was there, and I don't remember. I'm not sure I really assisted, because that was more technical than what I could do. But I went in to check on him. He was laying on the cart in the holding area before they took him back to surgery, and he started complaining of a bellyache. And they told me later that I don't think I went in on the surgery, but they told me later his abdominal aorta was starting to rupture while he was there on the table.
Oh, my.
So he went on and lived a couple more years and didn't have any complications from that. But I don't want to call him that close.
No, that's...
Yeah. I was glad it worked out, because his son being a classmate and all, I'd have hated to disappoint either one of them. But he came
Steve,
through.
the classes that you took in high school and in college, I believe you said zoology.
Mm-hmm.
Is that kind of get your thinking going to maybe going into the medical field?
I think I've thought about that for one reason or another. I'm not sure about what really got me started, other than I remember Dr. Ilias. We actually went to Dr. Ilias as our family physician, and I don't remember exactly why, but he had been our family doctor, and I had my share of illnesses as a kid. I had an appendectomy, and I had to have some type of eye surgery for a funny blood vessel in the eye that bugged my mother. Dr. Spies took that off, and then I had to have my appendix out, and then it just kind of got me interested in that. I thought that'd be a pretty good thing to know, and I probably knew by the time I was a freshman in high school, or maybe a little before. Also, our mother she thought with 7 kids, one of them ought to manage to be a doctor. And she would try to encourage one of my older brothers, but it didn't take with him. He didn't care for it. So I said, well, there's maybe my opportunity. My parents helped out a lot with my schooling. They funded me through college, and a big part of through medical school. And when we came back and was practicing, I had to take out a loan to pay off the money I had taken as a student loan from another town. It wasn't Marshall. And I think it was around $22,000 is what I recall. Nowadays, that's peanuts. They come out owing several $100,000, but I lived very frugally because I knew how hard my folks had to work to make that. But my parents found out how we were having to pay off this note, and they just went in and paid it off.
Wonderful.
And I never asked them once to do it. And they were generous to a fault with me and with the rest of us. They didn't. They never went wanting for anything, but they didn't lavish themselves with a lot of things like some people would. they held on to it and would give it tests, and they hadn't seemed to want to do that.
When you were growing up and going to high school, are there particular memories of Marshall and school experiences that really ring true or have been memorable?
Well, I can remember several instructors, and I think if anything, like with it used to be Miss Bevington, and it was later Mrs. Geyser, wasn't it? Or Miss Geyser and Mrs. Bevington. How it went. These people, by and large, if not all of them, were really dedicated to teaching us something, and they took it seriously, and they tried to be fair as far as I could tell. Of course, it didn't probably hurt that my dad was on the school board for a while. But, they really put an effort into trying to teach us. Unfortunately, the math teacher didn't have much luck with me because it just didn't soak in with me. In fact, that was one of the reasons I decided to go into medicine. I didn't think you had to have a lot of mathematics to do a lot of that. And I've gotten by so far, but I probably would have done a lot better financially if I had been better at math. Because I
Now you
would
got
have
a
calculated some of those things
Little
better.
tiny calculator does about everything.
Yeah, well, yeah, probably right. But
Thinking of downtown Marshall and maybe in the communities and all, and then moving back several years later, did you find Marshall had changed a lot?
well, not a whole heck of a lot. But there were just a lot more people I didn't recognize. But then was a whole other generation that had grown up behind me, and most of the people that I grew up with, a big percentage of them didn't stay around Marshall, so they were kind of gone. And some of the landmarks changed that I had grown up with, but most of them still were kind of the same. And so it was like coming back home for me. But wasn't quite so much for death. But
What are those a couple of those landmarks that you're referring to?
Oh, just the downtown, like Martin's Drugstore and Blankenship's. Not that I ever hung around in either one very much, but you used to be able to go into Martin's and get a soda or something like that, and that was still there kind of when I came back. But that was the end of that era. You can't go to a soda fountain drugstore anymore, not that I remember or come across. And I don't know if the Candy Kitchen was still operable in '79, but of course I was kind of out of that era.
Sure been that.
I don't remember when it finally closed.
Like Tom's was here.
Yeah, Tom's was still here, and Bill Kasumpis still ran it, and
Dime store.
yeah, the dime store and was still there, and for a few years, and those things changed hands, and they've changed around a lot. So, seen quite a few changes. I guess probably if there's any kind of disappointment, is to see the country as a whole, not just Clark County, has had such a tremendous decline in people living on the farm, and it's the economics of it is what's done it, I suppose. But the country's just empty, when there used to be a lot of houses around, and that's probably one of the biggest things I miss. It wasn't like we were terribly always visiting back and forth a lot. My folks used to visit back and forth with a few families, but houses that were around that I grew up, a lot of them just disappeared, and the people.
Steve, do you think a part of that, though, is the fact that right now a farmer with the huge equipment and all, I mean, he can farm several hundred acres versus 40 or 50.
Well, now it's several thousand acres.
Right.
And it's like I said, it's a matter of economics. Farm prices haven't gone up, and everything else has. And as far as what the farmer gets for it, so there's no other way for that to go, unfortunately.
You might talk about like how medicine changed when you first started practicing with the emergency room and the nursing home and.
Now, when I came down here, thank you. I came down here to practice with George. We ran a small area. We call it an emergency room downstairs.
That's right.
And it had an intercom that connected to the nursing home. At that time, the nursing home was much better off financially too than what it was. They had extra help, and when somebody would come in after hours or get ill after hours, instead of calling us, a lot of times they would just show up downstairs and talk into that intercom, and the nurse would come over. They would get them into the building and get them take their vitals and find out what the deal was, and if it was something that needed us to come out, then they would call whoever was on call, and we'd take our turns. Sometimes I'd be out there 2 or 3 times a night, about any hour you want to talk about. And there were a few occasions it might have made a difference for the patient if they hadn't stopped there and just gone straight to the hospital, but that's how they did it. And but that's eventually what happened. Got down to just George and I after Dr. Banning left and Dr. White left. We were a little too strapped, and we asked Jim Walsh from Terre Haute to come practice part-time at our office because we had more than we could do. And he tried taking call, but he couldn't really do it with any practicality from Terre Haute. And I'm not sure exactly how the decision came around, but I think part of it was a change in insurance. Up to that time, things were more loosely regulated in a lot of ways, and one of them was they could bring patients to our office even though it wasn't an emergency room. But the insurance and I think state law changed that you could only call an emergency room a true emergency room if it was attached to a full 24-hour full-service hospital, or have a physician on site, or with access to a hospital setting, and we didn't have that. When they designed that originally, there were 2 large rooms that could probably hold 8 or 10 people downstairs.
I remember that.
They envisioned that as a holding area to observe somebody overnight, give them IVs, and send them home in the morning if it was something simple. But I don't think it ever got utilized very much, and it didn't when I was there because I don't know. It came to the point where the nursing home's situation changed. They didn't have any spare nurses, and so they had to quit providing the services. That was the other thing that happened. So that it just had to go away. But the ambulances also said that they were going to have to quit coming because it was a liability issue. If they weren't really taking them to a true emergency room and the patient developed complications because they would be hung out to dry. So they wouldn't stand up legally. So they had to quit that. And I think in a way, if it hadn't quit, I probably wouldn't be alive because it could be grueling, and I needed more sleep than what that afforded. Work all day and then have to get up a couple times at night. George was used to that. It didn't seem to bother him much at all. Of course, he didn't complain of it. But I always said he was made of tougher stuff than most people, including me. But,
Well, I know I've always heard, I mean, the doctor's wife, and I know Dr. George, when he was starting too, she was right there as his nurse, but yet he was gone a lot. And I'm sure that's an influence too.
Well, he was gone a lot, that we got to be pretty good at answering the telephone, and even the kids knew, Chris, Megan, and Maria all knew how to answer the phone. They would say the name of our home, and they would ask, if they could take a message, they'd write it down, then we'd get a hold of Steve right away. So they were used to that. We'd go to church in 2 cars so that he could leave if he had to. So
what you've done is actually adjusted your lifestyle
sure.
to meet the schedule that was required.
And the kids were always very understanding about when Steve would have to leave an event, a sporting event or something at school, or not make it or come late. They were really good about it. So I think they appreciated it.
In these last number of years that you have been a medical doctor, what are you find is probably the most significant changes and developments that have taken place in that period of time?
There have been a tremendous number of scientific advancements. There are a lot of things that we can do and take care of now, people can be treated for, that were basically a death sentence years ago, or we had very little to offer. And there's a lot more that can be done now because they've made a lot of advancements scientifically in medicine. But a couple of the biggest ones is the whole what to call it, organized medicine, not from the doctor's standpoint, from HMOs, insurance plans, etc., that have put a completely new set of requirements on physicians. Too often we have to practice to what they will allow us to do, and and Medicare has been actually kind of took the first steps in that. Medicare started saying, well, no, we won't pay for that. They would typically, they always discounted everybody's bill.
Yeah.
In fact, I don't know if it was me or Dr. Mitchell, I actually one time received a note, or got a note that a patient gave us saying, we received a bill for these services, your doctor has overcharged you. He just said it right there right in the first paragraph. And they said, here's what we'll pay, we'll pay 80% of that.
Wow.
And you're responsible, or your co-insurance is responsible for the other 20%. And so I think Medicare was really the first instigator, and the insurance companies quickly followed suit. Mm-hmm. Then they wanted to discount bills, and then they wanted everything digitized. You couldn't just write an appendectomy. Of course, I didn't do appendectomies, but you didn't write what your diagnosis was, medical diagnosis, and you couldn't write it anyway. It had to be typed out, and it had to have a number assigned to it. And they're on the 10th iteration of that now.
Is that like a code equal
Yeah, it's a
system?
code. They call it the ICD code, International Code Diagnosis, I think. And so they're on the 10th iteration of that, and they just keep making it more and more complex. And it causes a lot of extra expense. And a lot of that gets passed on to the patient. I mean, despite what they say, they thought it was all going to come out of the hides of the physicians, but it didn't.
What is your opinion of this? I'll use the phrase Obamacare. There's been so much press on that in the last couple of years.
Well,
I don't mean politically, I mean just from the medical side.
Well, from a medical side, I think most doctors, if they stopped and thought about it, I think they would say, well, that should be a good thing for people. Most other first-tier countries, or in Europe and Asia, like Japan, have nationalized health care.
Oh, yeah.
And and we're taking a beating economically in some ways because we don't. At least that's an argument. I'm not enough of an economist to know for sure, but we're competing with all of them, and they seem to be staying ahead of us in a lot of ways. And a lot of them also, as far as the standard measures of health and well-being, physical and health and so forth, and say even newborn survival, we're not number one.
No, I don't think so.
We're down a ways, maybe 9th or 10th, or maybe lower, I don't know.
Is it
So-
Norway or some of the Scandinavian countries?
Some of the
pretty much at the
Scandinavian
top?
countries, of course, they pay 60 or 80% of their income for taxes. So that would take a real change in mindset. But they don't seem to live too bad. So I don't know. But I think it's hard for me to argue with them wanting to do this. It would be very selfish to think that to worry about myself first in that case, because we all have to have some type of health care, or we hope we can. But
Well, Doctor, some of the statistics I read now is basically the whole country is aging, and those over a certain age, I think now make up a big percent. Is that going to further complicate the issue with the Medicare and the being able to afford some of the medical care?
it probably is, because people are going to be retired longer. They're going to have to depend on Medicare longer. And the longer you live, the more health problems people tend to develop. One of the worst ones is diabetes. Since we're a relatively affluent country, probably at least a third of people are overweight, and that's a big, and I'm not pointing at you, I'm pointing at myself when I say that. That's one of the main contributing factors to diabetes. And so it's kind of a vicious cycle. But it used to be that people would die of pneumonia. Now they still do, but not with anything like it used to be, the rates at which it used to be. A lot of diseases have been prevented with immunizations, despite some people's objection to immunizations, which I think they're really wrong about.
But now we're coming back at some of those things that were, quote, cured a few years ago, like the measles epidemic now.
Well, and diphtheria.
Yes.
There are adults, you've probably walked by somebody that's had diphtheria, but they didn't have whooping cough. They didn't whoop. People don't realize this, but there was a lady, this is probably about 10 years ago, 10 or 15 years ago, who was a diabetic, and I think she died of pertussis in Terre Haute. It generally doesn't kill adults, but what it does is they are highly contagious, and they will give it to their grandchildren. In fact, I use that as an appeal for people to get updated on their pertussis immunization. I say, well, it probably won't kill you if you get it, but it might kill your grandchildren.
Next generation.
Especially in infancy. I only maybe ever saw one case of it in training, because immunizations had done such a wonderful job of getting rid of this. But people have gotten lax. They have forgotten those things. It's kind of like, when was the last time you saw somebody in braces and on crutches for polio? And so they can't make a strong enough argument against immunizations to satisfy me. I think it's darn near criminal if they don't. I've got some relation that's that way, but I don't even bring it up.
Well, it just seems like the vaccination, if we'll take care of it, why not? But there's a
Well-
psychological anti-feeling, I guess.
Well, part of it goes back to when they brought out the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. back in the 80s, I think it was. That was about the same time they came up with, they'd studied people who had autism and didn't know what to call it. And they decided, well, this is autism. Mm-hmm. And they coincided the two events, coming up with a diagnosis of autism and then measles, mumps, rubella vaccination, and they thought there was a cause and effect, and they've proven that there isn't, but they can't shake that stigma. And in fact, there was a noted British doctor that tried to make that case, and he kind of fiddled with the statistics. He, I think, had his license taken away.
I think I've read something about
And I can't remember what his name was, but he came out just vehemently opposed to the MMR because he thought this. And when they really analyzed it, they say he was so full of bunk, and plus he had altered the information in his favor, and they didn't like that, and they shouldn't have. He should have been punished.
Is tuberculosis becoming a issue or a problem again?
A bit more of one than it was for a long, long time, and it's basically as a spin-off problem from HIV and AIDS. People who have those things are poorly resistant to any infection who have HIV, and they're very susceptible to it and don't always show the regular signs, and even the skin test for tuberculosis is altered. They don't respond because their whole immune system is depressed and damaged, and so you have to read the TB skin test in light of whether or not they have HIV, because they won't have the reaction. I used to feel for how big the welt was that it raised, that you could feel. And they go by half as much size in an HIV patient as a regular patient.
Wow.
But there's also been an influx of a lot of immigrants, and I'm not trying to bring up a political football there, but other parts of the world still have a lot of TB.
Yeah.
Asia has had a lot of TB, various countries in Asia, and a lot of them come to this country, and they're not screened out very well. And used to be you couldn't make it past Ellis Island. They'd either send you back or you had to be shown fit, and I don't know that they're doing as good a job, and they're seeing a lot of this from other countries. And it's not necessarily their fault. I mean, but it's come back into the country.
In reading old news accounts of obituaries and older people, there's a phrase so often used: consumption. What was that? Actually a pneumonia, or what was that?
It was most often used to refer to tuberculosis.
Oh, really? Okay.
In fact, for maybe, I don't know how many years back, decades, maybe a couple hundred years, they knew kind of what the process of tuberculosis was. They didn't until people like Jenner and so forth came around and with scientific methods to figure out what was causing this. They didn't have an idea where it really came from, so it didn't get controlled very well, and it took even longer before they came up with any kind of treatment. But they knew about that, and it probably was misdiagnosed at times too, since they didn't have the cultures and so forth, and a lot of people that died of consumption probably just had one form or another of pneumonia, but it usually was referred to people who had dwindled, had gradually gone downhill, weakened, had a bad cough, became pale, just sicker and sicker and sicker until they finally succumbed. And I think it's just like it consumed them. ate them up. And when they looked in their lungs, where it was most often present, the lung was just destroyed. And I think that's where they got the idea. But it got into every organ in your body. In fact, John Strom, who was my dad's age, went on to be the editor of National Wildlife, went to Marshall here, and Dean Strom's brother, traveled around the world before or just after World War II. One of the first people in communist China. Had that when he was in high school. He had it in one of his leg bones.
Really?
And he was a contemporary of George. I think they played alongside each other some. And they didn't have anything much to do about it. He had a chronic draining ulcer in his leg for years. He could play basketball apparently so long, and then he'd have to sit down because it just hurt too bad.
For heaven's sake.
I don't know how he ever got it cleared up. He probably lived long enough that they came up with some of the other treatments in the 40s and early 50s and were able to clear him up. But it was a bad disease.
Another phrase that's used a lot in old obituaries, and I think it's a problem even today, is the dementia thing. Is there work being done on that scientifically?
There's a lot of work being done on it. It's not anything that I get in touch with in an office setting, family practice. But there are some treatments out now that can help slow the advancement of it. Unfortunately, they're all kind of expensive and they've all got some side effects. But they're still doing a lot of research. That will be a wonderful day when they get that figured out. But there are some genetic markers for people prone to have developed dementia, but it's not 100% accurate. And the problem with getting the test is if you find out you got it, what are you going to do about it? But they've got a long ways to go as far as I know. If they've got a breakthrough ready, they haven't shown their hand yet.
What would be a person in your lifetime and all that's probably been most influential to you?
Well, after my wife, of course. Probably my parents. I developed a sense of not wanting to ever disappoint them. And probably, well, and what I thought might disappoint them, I didn't tell them about, generally. My mom's religious background has helped me a lot in her patience with all of us. And my dad's sense of what's right and what's wrong. And I think those are both probably the two biggest personal influences.
Is there a particular world event or something that's happened over the years in your lifetime that's, boy, really influenced your thinking?
Oh, there's been too many of them. Somebody was talking here, one of my brothers talking about some of these recent events with the police shootings, and he said, well, of course they shoot first. They're at high risk. And he said, well, they're not even among the 10 top most dangerous jobs. You not want to put that in there. But he said, if you really want a dangerous job, become the President of the United States. How many did we say was, how many, there had been 44 presidents of the United States, and how many of them had been assassinated? Starting with, wasn't Lincoln the first? And then Garfield, and who else? Kennedy, and that's pretty high. Pardon?
Attempts.
And there were other attempts.
Oh, yeah.
And so, you got, that's, it was close to 1 out of 11 were murdered in office. And so, you know, it's given me a new respect for the presidency, and but didn't really make me want to be one either. That was the least of it.
You're not going to start campaigning?
No, I don't think I'm going to start campaigning for that, or probably any other political office. But,
Maybe if you were living or went to, say, another country, somewhere in Europe or something, someone would say, Marshall, where on earth is that? What would you tell them about our town and why it's a good place? Why they might want to at least visit here?
well, I would probably tell them that it's an oddity in the sense that it's not rush, rush, rush. That it's a quiet, small town, and at least when I was growing up, I thought it turned out to be a very good place to raise a family. And fortunately for us, for the most part, raising our own children, it was still that way. But modern times catch up with even small towns, so small towns sharing a lot of the same problems now. But I think that's one of the, as I said at first, it's probably one of the things I'm grateful to God about, because to have grown up here and to be able to go on if you wanted to, but come back if you wanted to.
Well, I think a lot of, you mentioned it earlier, small town, you get a school, can't wait to get out of here. But I think once you get out, then you have more appreciation for Marshall. Than
Yeah,
you did
I mean,
here.
if you're looking for a lot of excitement, this is not the place to be.
No.
But if you enjoy day-to-day living and being able to sit down and talk to people, that I don't think you get that in a bigger city. Even Terre Haute, I don't think you do. People just don't connect as much.
And most visitors usually comment too on how clean the community is. People take care and have pride in their real estate and do a good job of taking care of it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Steve, it's been a real delight visiting with you. And you said you didn't have a whole lot to say, but I got into a lot more of the medical side than really I expected to. But that's what I find is interesting in talking to the people, is their careers and how it's experienced, how they've lived, and how they have used that for their life. And I think this is not for someone to listen to, look at necessarily tomorrow, but it's going to be in print for the future. And that's, again, part of the history.
Maybe I'll have something for my great-grandkids to see if I'm not here.
So I appreciated your time very much.
Well, thank you for allowing me to do this.
We appreciate that.
Appreciate it.